Chapter 7 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Dana Tucker. www.yourpodcastreview.com. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9. By John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Early's Campaign Against Washington. Some of the most stirring scenes of the Great Virginia Campaign of 1864 took place in the valley of the Shenandoah, and it was here that the first gleams of the final victory shone upon the Union arms. During the whole war, this valley had been a vast, covered way which sheltered the advance and retreat of every Confederate force that invaded the North or menaced Washington. The towering Blue Ridge guarded it on the east. The North Mountains, a portion of the great Allegheny chain, formed its western wall. Every movement of troops along its course was to the advantage of the Confederates. As it ran to the northeast, each step brought them nearer to the unguarded rear of Washington. When they chose to withdraw, they drew the pursuing Union forces every minute further away from their base. They did not lose their advantage even in crossing the Potomac. The Cumberland Valley of Maryland and Pennsylvania is merely a prolongation of that of the Shenandoah. The South Mountain continues the wall of the Blue Ridge, and under its protective cover, an invading force more than once carried devastation with fire and steel along the quiet rural hamlets of Pennsylvania. Early in the campaign, Grant felt the necessity of closing to the enemy this path of approach and of taking from them this fertile region from which they drew such plentiful stores of substance. But it continued throughout the summer to be the racetrack of rushing armies, and autumn arrived before it was finally and forever wrenched from the weakened hands of the rebellion. Our narrowing limits will not allow us to describe in detail the moving incidents of this crowded campaign. A bare outline of what was accomplished must suffice. We have already spoken of the failure of Sigel's movement in May, and his defeat by Breckinridge at Newmarket, which in public opinion obscured the fair measure of success obtained by Crook in his victory at Cloyd's Mountain and the destruction of New River Bridge. Grant and Halleck were equally dissatisfied with General Sigel, and the gallant veteran David Hunter was appointed in his stead. He moved southward with characteristic energy and speed, defeated and killed General W. E. Jones at Piedmont on the 5th of June, pushed rapidly on to Stanton, and thence up to the fortifications of Lynchburg. This place, however, was of such vital importance to the Confederacy that General Lee had hurried heavy reinforcements forward under Early to protect it, and Hunter, whose supplies and ammunitions were almost exhausted, found himself unable to carry the strong works by which it was surrounded or to fight the veteran army by which it was newly garrisoned. He therefore wisely resolved to retreat by way of the Kawana instead of the Shenandoah, which would have been extremely hazardous in view of Early's strength. But this march took much time, and meanwhile the broad valley lay an open road before the Confederates, leading directly to Maryland and the rear of Washington. The temptation provided irresistible to General Lee. He felt himself unable to cope with Grant in the open field. He knew his best opportunities lay in those assaults upon his entrenchments, with which Grant had of late so frequently gratified him. When after his easy and most valuable victory at Cold Harbor, he detached Early to protection of Lynchburg, he had given him orders to strike Hunter's force in the rear and, if possible, to destroy it, then to move down the valley, cross the Potomac, and threaten Washington. After Early had arrived at Lynchburg and Hunter had retreated by the west, General Lee left it to Early's judgment whether to carry out the original plan or to return to Petersburg and as doubtless knew enough of Early's enterprising temper to be sure which course he would pursue. We are not left in the dark as to Lee's feeling in this matter. On the 20th of June, after the assaults upon Petersburg were over and the siege had begun, he wrote to Jefferson Davis, "I still think it is our policy to draw the attention of the enemy to his own territory. It may force Grant to attack me or weaken his force. It will also, I think, force Hunter to cross the Potomac or expose himself to the attack. From either of these events I anticipate good results." His subsequent letters, however, show that his strongest hope and reliance was that Grant, goaded by the menace in the North, would rush furiously upon his works at Petersburg. Early started northward with about 17,000 men. He traveled with great expectation, having reduced his impediments to the minimum. He reached Winchester on the 2nd of July and sent his cavalry forward to destroy the railroad in rear of Sigel and, if possible, to cut off his retreat. But Sigel made his way to Shepherdstown in time to save most of the stores in his charge, and Colonel J. A. Mulligan, well known for his gallant defense of Lexington, checked the Confederate cavalry in an engagement at Leetown, enabling Sigel to establish himself safely on Maryland Heights, where, once fixed, he remained in spite of demonstrations to the right and left of him. This move was a serious disappointment to Early. "My desire had been," he said, "to maneuver the enemy out of Maryland Heights so as to enable me to move directly from Harper's Ferry to Washington." But he had taken refuge in his strongly fortified works, and as they could not be approached without great difficulty, an attempt to carry them by assault would have resulted in greater loss than the advantage to be gained would justify. I determined to move through the gaps of the South Mountain. At daybreak on the 8th of July, his whole force began to move through these passes. The next morning, General B.T. Johnson was sent with a brigade of cavalry and a battery of horse artillery to break all the railroads leading to the Baltimore and threaten that city, then to move towards Point Lookout to cooperate in a scheme for the release of the prisoners there, which has been devised at Richmond. These orders to Johnson form the strongest proof that Early really hoped to capture the capital. The force of Johnson was sent to Lookout, to use Early's own words, for the purpose of releasing the prisoners if we should succeed in getting into Washington. This purpose of Early was not so absurd as after its failure it seemed. It cannot be denied that Washington had been left nearly unguarded. The Confederate felt by the President and the Presidents of Grant had permitted almost all the effective force to be sent to the Army of the Potomac. Hunter's line of retreat had opened the valley to the Confederates, and he was now, with the greatest possible exertion, it is true, striving to make his way back to his post against the obstacles of bad roads and low water in the river. With his exhausted and footsore soldiers, there was no chance of his arriving before the enemy. General Lay, Wallace, who in Hunter's absence had been left in command of the department, had a small force at Baltimore. Washington was garrisoned by a force of 100 days' men, the Veterans Reserve, or Invalid Corps, District of Columbia Volunteers, and a few dismounted cavalry. As the enemy approached, General Meigs hastily organized some 2,000 quartermasters, employees, and put them into the lines. In numbers, the garrison was strong enough to withstand attack, being a total of 20,000 men of all sorts, but they were mostly raw, undisciplined, and unavailable. The great reliance was, after all, in the fortifications which had been constructed with the greatest care, and supported and commanded each other in such fashion that a comparatively small force of disciplined troops could have held them indefinitely against any attack. Halleck reported to General Grant this state of affairs, but the General-in-Chief was slow to believe that any serious movement was in progress. After Early had seized Martinsburg so late as the 3rd of July, Grant insisted that he was at Petersburg and that it was impossible he could be threatened by Hunter's department. But after Grant became convinced that Early was on the Potomac, he at once ordered the 6th Corps to the rescue. Ricketts, who started first going into Baltimore when he arrived on the 8th, and Wright, with Getty's and D.A. Russell's divisions, embarked at midnight on the 9th and coming directly to Washington. There was never a more opportune march and arrival. The advance of Early's caused great consternation throughout Maryland and southern Pennsylvania. The quiet farmers saw their crops stolen by the troopers or committed to the flames. The towns were laid under ruinous requisition of money. $200,000 at Frederick, $20,000 at Hagerstown, on pain of conflagration in case of refusal. His reassuring proclamations, taken in connection with the action of his soldiers, did nothing to allay the terror excited by his march. He proceeded on his way without opposition until moving out of Frederick. He met the force with which General Wallace had come from Baltimore, and which, although it had been much aided and strengthened by Ricketts' fine division of 6th Corps, was obviously inadequate to cope with General Early's army. At the Monocacy River, General Wallace made a credible fight. General Ricketts, who behaved with his usual coolness and energy, was severely wounded, and both sides suffered considerable loss in killed and wounded. Wallace lost heavily in prisoners, and in the evening fell back on the road to Baltimore, and Early was too full of the thought of Washington to waste time in pursuing. He marched at daylight on the 10th on the Georgetown Pike, and camped at night only 4 miles north of Rockville. It was an anxious Sunday throughout the North. Troops were everywhere called out in vigorous degrees of unreadiness. Every available man in Baltimore and Washington was put into the trenches. Johnson's cavalry was active in northern Maryland. Harry Gilmore captured 2 passenger trains at Gunpowder River, backed one of them upon the Great Bridge, and burned bridge and train together. But the principal object of Johnson's raid, the release of Confederate prisoners at Point Lookout, was not accomplished, nor even attempted. The burning of Governor Bradford's house in the suburbs of Baltimore gained the Confederate arms neither credit nor advantage. It had been the habit of all military writers who have discussed this campaign to represent the civil departments of the government as a prey to terror and panic this and the following day. But those who were at Richmond were not the best witnesses of what was taking place at Washington. Neither Lincoln nor Stanton, nor even Halleck, whom it is still more fashionable to abuse, lacked coolness or energy in the emergency. They, of course, recognized the fact that Washington was imperfectly defended and the possibility of its capture, but they regarded this contingency as highly improbable, and not satisfied with repulsing the enemy. They were especially anxious that a force strong enough to move out and destroy Early's army would be put in motion for Washington. Grant entirely agreed in this view. If the rebel force, he said, now north, can be captured or destroyed, I would willingly postpone aggressive operations to destroy them. He even offered, if the president thought it was advisable, to leave everything at Petersburg on the defensive, and to start for Washington at an hour's notice to command in person the operations against Early. The president, in his anxiety to have the invading forces destroyed, accepted this proposition, saying he thought there was really a fair chance of doing it if the moment were prompt. At the same time, with his habitual consideration for a trusted general, he told Grant that this was in pursuance of his own suggestion and was not an order. Grant, however, on reflection, had changed his mind and concluded it would have been a bad effect for him to leave Petersburg at that moment. He telegraphed to the president his belief, in view of the fact that Wright and Ord and Hunter were on the ground, that the enemy will never be able to get back with much of his forces. The president could not entirely share this place's fate. He had too often seen the enemy retire from the Potomac undisturbed by pursuit, but he answered General Grant's dispatch, expressing his satisfaction at his decision, but adding, "The enemy will learn of Wright's arrival, and then the difficulty will be to unite Wright and Hunter south of the enemy before he will recross the Potomac." Some firing between Rockville and here now, even with the sound of hostile guns in his ears, he writes with the utmost calmness to General Grant at Petersburg, thinking only of the chance of crushing the army which had ventured so far from its base, and forecasting the actual result far more accurately than the general. He thought perhaps too little of his personal safety. On the night of the 10th he left the White House, as usual, and rode out to a summer residence at the Soldiers' Home, in the northern suburb a few miles from Early's bivouac. Other officers of the government, in view of possible contingencies, displayed of this impassive conduct. Mr. Stanton, finding the enemy advancing in heavy force on the Tenellytown and 7th Street roads, sent out to the Soldiers' Home and insisted upon the President's coming into Washington. And Captain Fox, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, without the President's knowledge, had a vessel made ready in case of a serious disaster. General Early left his camp near Rockville at the dawn on the 11th and pushed forward with eager hopes upon Washington. The infantry, turning to the left, advanced by the 7th Street road, which runs by Silver Spring into the city, with a cloud of cavalry on either flank. The day was hot and dusty, and the troops suffered greatly, but inspired by the prospect of the rich prize before them, they plodded onward with a great heart, and shortly after noon, Early, riding a little in advance of his columns, came in sight of Fort Stevens, which guarded the entrance to Washington by 7th Street. A brief survey convinced him that the works were being feebly managed. The greatest achievement of the war seemed to be within his grasp. He ordered General Rhodes to bring his division into line as rapidly as possible, and to move into the works if he could. But before the column, which was moving by flanks, could be brought up, Early, who was gazing intently at the line of works in his front, saw to his infinite vexation a column of men in blue filing into them on the right and left. A fringe of skirmishers was thrown out in front, and from all the batteries in range a sharp artillery fire opened. His hopes of surprise passed away, the wreathing smoke of the national guns, and he gave orders for a close reconnaissance of the position. The whole afternoon was consumed in his work. As it proceeded, the prospect for the Confederates became every hour more discouraging. The obstacles might have appeared insurmountable to even a better soldier than General Early. Enclosed forts for a heavy artillery within a tier of lower works in front of each, pierced for an immense number of guns, the whole being connected by curtains with ditches in front and strengthened by palisades and abatements. Every possible approach was raked with artillery. In vain did he seek a point of entry on either side. As far as his eye could reach to the left over the bare spaces, where the forest had been leveled to give play to the guns, the same powerful works, and his cavalry coming in from the right reported the fortifications on the Georgetown pike to be still more impregnable. Early might as well be excused for his declining to rush his tired army upon these bristling works. He had less than 20,000 men. He says about 800,000 muskets, but he always looked at his own force through the wrong end of his field glasses, and he was laboring under a serious error in regard to the troops in front of him. He had captured some of the 6th Corps on the Monarchy. The newspapers had informed him of the departure of heavy reinforcements from Petersburg. And when he saw the improvised levies of General Augur filing into the works in the afternoon, he came, not unnaturally, to the conclusion that he had to deal with the veterans of the Army of the Potomac. This supposed state of affairs called for the most careful preparation, and before the preparations were completed, what he had imagined had become true. Wright, with his two magnificent divisions, had landed at the wharf, being received by President Lincoln in person amid a tumult of joyous cheering, and the advance of the 19th Corps under W. H. Emory was also on the streets of Washington. When the rear of Early's infantry closed up in the evening, the capital was already safe from a coup de main. It was with much diminution of his high spirits of the morning that Early called his generals together for consultation on the night of the 11th. There was clearly no time to be lost. Washington must be assaulted immediately, if at all. The passes of South Mountain will soon be closed, he said, not knowing that Julius Stolber's troopers had already occupied them. But it was like parting soul and body for Early to give up his hope of seizing Washington, and he broke up the conference, saying he would assault the works at daybreak next morning unless it was previously be shown to be impracticable. In the night he received false information from Bradley T. Johnson that 2 corps of the Army of the Potomac had arrived. He therefore delayed his attack until he could make one final reconnaissance. He rode to the front and found the parapets lined with troops. With the dome of the Capitol in his sight, gilded by the rays of the rising sun, he gave up all hope of capturing Washington. He knew, however, that it would be most unwise to turn and run by daylight in the face of such an enemy, and therefore determined to maintain a bold front until nightfall and then make good his retreat. The evening before, Wright had proposed to send out a brigade to clear away the enemy's skirmish line, but this was not thought advisable by General Augur until the Union lines were better established. At night, the 6th Corps relieved the pickets and entrenched their line. On the morning of the 12th, skirmishing began and continued all the morning, and in the afternoon Daniel D. Bridwell's brigade of Getty's division was sent out by Wright to drive the Confederate skirmishers from a house and orchard near Silver Springs Road. Rhodes' division, which was in possession of the place, stood its ground handsomely, and a severe engagement ensued, which has a special interest from the fact that it was fought in full view of the Capitol and was witnessed by the President of the United States on one side and on the other by General Breckinridge, the candidate who had received the suffrages of seceding states in 1860. The President had resultantly refrained from giving military orders during the invasion, though sorely tempted to do so on account of the disinclination of Grant and Halleck to interfere with each other's authority. But his interest in the progress of affairs was intense and ardent, and his presence among the soldiers roused the greatest enthusiasm. When Rhodes' division arrived on the afternoon of the 11th, he saw the first shots exchanged in front of Fort Stevens, and stood in the fort, his tall figure making him a conspicuous mark, until ordered to withdraw, and on the 12th, when Bridwell's brigade marched in perfect order out of the works to drive the enemy from the Riv's house, the President again stood apparently unconscious of danger, watching with that grave and passive countenance the progress of the fight amid the whizzing bullets of the sharpshooters until the officer fell mortally wounded within 3 feet of him, and General Wright premortably represented to him the needless risk he was running. The national troops marched out with discipline, valor, worthy of the place and of the spectators. They advanced in unbroken formation up the slight acclivity in the face of a destructive fire, drove the Confederates from the orchard and the grove which sheltered them, and pushed the enemy's pickets back for a mile. The success was gained not without loss. 280 of the small force engaged were killed and wounded. General Early waited only for nightfall to withdraw his troops from a position which had become full of peril. The next morning his campus had vanished. Everybody was eager for the pursuit to begin, but Grant was too far away to give the necessary orders. The President, true to the position he had taken when Grant was made General-in-Chief, would not interfere, though he observed with anguish the undisturbed retreat of Early. Halleck, whose growing disposition to avoid responsibility had become only too apparent, merely told Augur what Wright ought to do, to strike the retiring column, and at noon Wright, having been put by a telegram from Grant in command of all available troops, got away at the head of a considerable force and marched with commendable celerity to Poolesville, 26 miles from Washington, which he reached on the evening of the 14th. But Early had too long a start, and his hardy infantry were too fleet to be overtaken. He crossed the Potomac at White's Fords in Loudoun County, and on the morning of the 14th, taking with him most of the plunder he had amassed in Maryland. Wright reported on the evening of the 14th to Halleck for instructions, believing that his force, about 10,500, was not sufficient to justify his crossing the river in pursuit of Early. Halleck answered in general terms, repeating Grant's wish that pursuit should be made. At first, Grant's orders were priority for pursuit, but his knowledge of the situation was imperfect. On the 13th, he was anxious only that the enemy should be driven out of Maryland. On the next day, finding Early was south of the river, he urged a helter-skelter pursuit by veterans, militia men, on horseback, and everything that could be got to follow, to eat out Virginia clear and clean as far as they go, so that crows flying over it for the balance of the season would have to carry their provision with them. In a letter on the same date, he said that Hunter should make the valley a desert. But on the 16th, the day Early, after 2 days' rest near Leesburg, resumed his march towards the passes of the Blue Ridge, which led into the valley, Grant changed his mind about the pursuit, and said to Halleck that there could be no use in Wright's following the enemy a day behind, and ordered, as soon as the rebel army is known to have passed Hunter's forces, recall Wright and send him back with all dispatch, and also send the 19th Corps. Halleck protested, and with reason, against executing these orders so long as Early remained in the valley. They were suspended, then repeated, and again suspended, and the 6th and 19th Corps were finally allowed to stay where great glory and usefulness awaited them. Wright crossed the river and chased Early to the Shenandoah. Hunter, having come up on the other flank, continued the pursuit, but the Confederates were so far in advance that little damage was done until the 20th of July, when Hunter's cavalry, under W.M.W. Averell, moved out from the Martinsburg and inflicted a stinging defeat upon Reserve's division. Early retired to Strasburg, where he arrived on the 22nd. Wright, meanwhile, returned to Washington, and on the 24th Early turned upon Crook, who was at Kernstown, and routed him, the gallant Colonel Mulligan being mortally wounded. Crook, however, made his retreat in good order and with such skill as to save his artillery and trains. Early followed in hot pursuit and drove the Union forces across the Potomac. The President had feared and partly anticipated this disaster. He had telegraphed to Hunter on the 23rd, "Are you able to take care of the enemy when he turns back upon you?" And he probably will, on finding that Wright had left. And Hunter had answered that his force was insufficient for the purpose. General Grant's distance from the scene and lack of perfect knowledge of the situation, the President's unwillingness to interfere with his orders, and Halleck's reluctance to assume authority which he thought did not belong to him, were the causes to which may be attributed to the unsatisfactory progress of affairs during this discouraging midsummer season. There was, notwithstanding, perfect harmony of feeling and intention between Grant and the government. They were all resolved, regardless of personal or political considerations, to do everything possible to end the war. Grant had no hesitation in asking on the 19th of July that the President should call for 300,000 men to recruit the armies wasted by a precipitously destructive campaign, although the effect of such a call could not be too damaging to the administration at the onset of a presidential campaign. And the President was able to answer this dispatch by informing the general that he had already, on the 18th, issued a call for 500,000 men to be drafted after September 5th, if not previously furnished. Which I am supposed, he added, simply covers the case. Always glad to hear your suggestions. But for the moment, there was no adequate force in front of Early, and encouraged by his long immunity, the instincts of a freebooter began to wake in him, and he determined upon a rapid campaign of plunder and destruction. His appetite for valid money had been whetted by the exactions levied on the unfortunate towns which he had visited in Maryland, and he now sent his cavalry forward under John McCausland to ransom or destroy other towns near the border of the state and Pennsylvania. The town of Chambersburg was the first one selected for the barbarous treatment. McCausland reached the place on the 30th of July and presented to some of the citizens a rest for that purpose of written demand for $500,000 in currency or $100,000 in gold on penalty of the immediate destruction of the town. Whether Early's purposely made a demand impossible to meet, or whether his ignorance and greed became equal, he thought the wealth of the North was unlimited, can only be conjectured. The truth was the arresting citizens could no more have produced such a sum on the moment than they could have performed any other miracle. But McCausland had no discretion. His superior expressly states in his memoir that his orders were peremptory. The Confederate general first made sure of his breakfast at a hotel, and then ordered Gilmore to burn the town. The task was no welcome one for even this hardened raider. I felt more like weeping over Chambersburg, he said, but his work was thoroughly done. The conflagration seemed to spring from one vast building. How piteous the sight in those beautiful green meadows, groups of women and children, exposed to the rays of a burning sun, hovered over the few articles they had saved, most of them wringing their hands and with wild gestation bemoaning their ruined homes. From Chambersburg, McCausland rode to Hancock, Maryland, where he demanded a ransom of $30,000. This, says Gilmore, was so out of the reason that we Marylanders remonstrated. He told the principal men of the place that unless the money was paid, he would burn the town. Gilmore, whose sympathies were now thoroughly aroused for the people of his own state, seeing that the place was in imminent risk of being plundered before it was burned, made an effort with his own troopers to guard the houses, while the terrified citizens were trying to raise the money McCausland had required. Before this was accomplished, Avero's cavalry came upon the scene, drove out the Confederates, and saved the town, as well as Mechanicsburg and Bedford, which had also been marked for destruction. McCausland retreated to Cumberland, where on the 1st of August he had a sharp skirmish with General Kelly, and then crossed the Potomac and withdrew to Moorefield in West Virginia. Thither Hunter dispatched General Averill, who on the 7th attacked and routed McCausland, capturing all his guns and trains with over 400 prisoners, and scattering the residue of the Confederate cavalry through the bridle paths of the mountains. General Early frankly admits, this affair had a very damaging effect upon my cavalry for the rest of the campaign. While these operations were going on, the National infantry were marching and countermarching in every direction, to little purpose. Under contradictory orders, and had at last been posted at Frederick to guard against another possible advance on Washington. The confusion arose primarily from the fact that General Grant disbelieved in Early's movement northward up to the moment he defeated Crook at Kernstown, and therefore wanted the Sixth Corps sent back to him, and that Halleck, holding a different belief, yet hesitated about taking the responsibility of giving the orders absolutely necessary under the circumstances. Grant was too far away to take advantage of the hourly changes in the situation, and Hunter, who was as zealous and energetic as a man need be, was rendered powerless by the lack of harmonious cooperation between his two superior officers. Grant, seeing the difficulty, had recommended the consolidation of the four departments, the Susquehanna, the Middle, Western Virginia, and Washington, under one command, and had mentioned for that duty General W.B. Franklin. This suggestion was not favorably received by the War Department, and General Grant next suggested General Meade. The President, seeing more clearly than anyone else the wide range of personal complications which such a change would involve, asked Grant to name a time when they could meet at Fort Monroe, but their meeting was prevented by the state of affairs at Deep Bottom and Petersburg. On the 1st of August, General Grant made a new choice, which was one of his happiest inspirations, and formed a resolution which proved of an estimable benefit in its result. He hastily relieved General Sheridan from the command of the Cavalry Corps and ordered him north, sending an additional division of cavalry after him. At the same time informing Halleck, "I am sending General Sheridan for temporary duty whilst the enemy is being expelled from the border. Unless General Hunter is in the field in person, I want Sheridan put in command of all the troops in the field, with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death. Wherever the enemy goes, let our troops go also." This dispatch was shown to the President. It embodied precisely his own wishes. He had been agonizing to have exactly this thing done. But he found in conversation with Halleck, and perhaps with others, that no measures, or at least none significantly energetic, were being taken to carry Grant's suggestion into effect. He had before this remarked, with pain and disappointment, a tendency in General Halleck to shrink from the exercise of authority in emergencies and throw upon himself or Grant the burden of all important decisions. He saw in this instant that if he did not interfere, the campaign would be lost by hesitation and delay. In violation, therefore, of all official etiquette, and as some critics think of propriety, he telegraphed to Grant on the 3rd of August, quoting his dispatch, giving above and adding, "This, I think, is exactly right, as to how our forces should move. But please look over the dispatches you may have received from here, ever since you made that order, and discover, if you can, therein any idea in the head of anyone here of putting our army south of the enemy, or of following him to the death, in any discretion. I repeat to you, it will neither be done nor attempted unless you watch it every day and hour and force it. We will not stop to defend the taste or regularity of this dispatch." It was at least perfectly lucid, and it answered the purpose. In 2 hours Grant was on the way to Monocacy Station, where he arrived the next evening. It was evident by this time that a defensive position at Frederick was no longer necessary, and that the point already selected by Hunter at Halltown for the concentration of his troops might be occupied at once. This was immediately done under Grant's instructions, which provided further for an active campaign against the enemy and the devastation of the Shenandoah Valley, so that nothing should be left to invite the enemy to return. Take all provisions, forage, and stock wanted for the use of your command. Such as cannot be consumed, destroyed. It is not desirable that the buildings should be destroyed. They should rather be protected. But the people should be informed that so long as an army can subsist among the recesses of these raids must be expected, and we are determined to stop them at all hazards. The move to Hulltown brought Hunt's army upon Early's right flank and rear. Early had again moved on the 4th to the Potomac, a demonstration which had become instinctive with him, and the next day his whole army had crossed once more into Maryland by the Williamsport and Shepherdstown Forge, visiting the Antietam battleground. But this threatening movement made no impression on the impassive commander of the national armies. His habit of minimizing his enemy's numbers here stood to his advantage. He wrote to Halleck that there was no great force of the enemy north of the Potomac, and in fact Early only remained one day, and on the 7th retired to Bunker Hill. In conversation with General Hunter, Grant suggested that he should establish the headquarters of his department at Cumberland or Baltimore, leaving the Shenandoah the command of the troops in the field. The gallant veteran promptly offered to resign his position, as it seemed that another officer could assume it with the prospect of more harmonious relations with his superiors, and consequently of more successful results. Grant eagerly accepted this generous self-sacrifice, and telegraphed for Sheridan to come to the Monocacy. He responded in person by special train. The troops were all gone over to the Potomac to Hulltown. No one was left at the station but the 3 generals and their staffs. Grant, in a few words, gave Sheridan the instructions he had prepared for Hunter and returned to Petersburg. Sheridan, on the 7th of August at Harper's Ferry, formally assumed command of the Middle Military Division, comprising the 4 departments already mentioned. His army, which was afterwards called the Army of the Shenandoah, consisted of the 6th Corps under General Wright, the 19th Corps, part present and part on the way, under General Cavalier Grover, Crook's Army of the Western Virginia, Talbert's division of cavalry from the Army of the Potomac, and Charles L. Lowell, Jr., Reserve Brigade. Alvarez's division, Alfred N. Duff's troops, and J. H. Wilson's division of cavalry from the Army of the Potomac were also on the march to join him. Sheridan desired that this splendid cavalry force should be made a corps and commanded by one of his own men, and Grant immediately authorized this to be done. In spite of Averell's recent and brilliant success, A. T. A. Talbot was made chief of cavalry, and Merritt succeeded to the command of his division. It was, of course, the finest army ever brought together in the Shenandoah Valley, consisting of some 22,000 infantry present for duty, and of about 8,000 horses. The field returns showed nearly 50% more than these figures, or about 43,000 officers and men. But all proper reductions being made, both Grant and Sheridan regarded 30,000 as the fighting force of the Army of the Shenandoah. End of Chapter 7. Recorded by Dana Tucker. www.yourpodcastreview.com